Lesson 7, who is to blame for the Cold War? This is the last lesson in this topic, believe it or not. You've done very well to this point. Now we're going to really get into the meat of it and evaluate what we have. And you're going to have to think about what we've talked about from lessons 1 through this particular lessons, put it all together, and before you reach the point of examination, have a good idea who was responsible, because they'll often challenge you in 10-mark questions, something to the effect of, how far do you agree that the Soviet Union was most responsible for the escalation in tensions following World War II? And you'll have to evaluate what the degree to which the Soviets were encounter with perhaps reasons that they're not, eventually arriving at a conclusion that they were or weren't. And really, what matters about this is that you have an opinion, and you can back your opinion up, not necessarily what your opinion is. So let's get into the balance of arguments, because historians to this day debate who was responsible. So we're going to take it case by case. And we'll start with the Russians first, the case against the USSR. Historians argue effectively that communist ideology was expansionist and universal. Marx, in his original documents, of course, always talks about worldwide communist revolution. And some of the early communists, Leon Trotsky, for instance, talked about the international revolution. And the goal of the Soviet Union should be international revolution. They are somewhat marginalized, but nevertheless, the prevailing belief in the West and the prevailing belief amongst many communists is that capitalism and communism cannot coexist. Therefore, communism needs to impose its own system of government throughout the world through takeover, as lovely and as interestingly indicated in the cartoon to the right there. There's lots of evidence to support this view. Number one, the USSR doesn't abide by any of the agreements it makes at Yalta and Potsdam. That's very much a Stalin trait. An agreement is only good as far as Stalin wants that agreement to be good. And when he decides it's not good, he's not going to be bound by convention. He's not going to be bound by some overriding sense of morality or guilt in breaking that. And of course, we know he instills communist governments all over Eastern Europe. He bans opposition parties. He throws people who oppose him in jail or outright murders them in some cases. Organizations play a key role in the case against the USSR. You look at Comecon. Comecon ensures that each country followed a Soviet model economic policy, that it followed the Soviet way to the letter. And that's really important when you consider, people are wondering, is this the beginning of a worldwide communist takeover? Well, not only are they taking over countries, they're forcing them to follow the Soviet model. Stalin uses ideological language when condemning the West and justifying his own actions. He talks about how the capitalist West are poisoning, that the religion of the West is the opiate of the people. These types of things are straight out of Karl Marx, and they sort of indicate that Stalin is following what's in the Communist Manifesto. Additionally, Cominform is another clear sign that he intends to undermine any capitalist society through controlling communist parties in every one of those countries. Cominform's goal, apart from coordinating all of the governments, is to ensure that no other opposition governments spring up, and he's very successful at that. What's more is historians also say that Stalin was aggressive, confrontational in nature, and hardly anyone can disagree with that. And his control over Russian foreign policy made relations very bad. At many points during the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, Soviet diplomats told him not to be so confrontational with the Americans, but he outright ignores them. And Stalin plays to his own tune and very much does as he wishes, and as such escalates tension by himself to a good degree. I mean, for one example of this is think of Stalin reacted to the finding out of the atomic bomb. He didn't have to be so bellicose when approaching Truman, talking about how he's so betrayed. He knew, but he still decided to use that to make political hay, if you will, and push the issue. Now, with reason, perhaps, you need to understand that there are justifications for the actions of the USSR. Some historians give the USSR a little bit of a pass. They say that basically the security concerns that they had and felt after the end of the Second World War were a huge influence on relations, and rightfully so, they should be. And to repeat the reasons ad nauseum, I mean, Russia had obviously been invaded twice by Germany in 25 years, and it wanted it, rightfully so, to be punished pretty severely for that. They didn't want it to happen again, very similar to how France felt, of course, at the end of the First World War. He was angry at the British because they didn't share the Enigma codes, and they'd broken the German codes that could have helped the Russians save potentially millions of lives in their own army, but the British, distrusting of the Russians, didn't give them these codes. They also believed that the Western Allies delayed opening up a second front in the West against the Germans. And they believed that they did so to weaken the USSR, so the Germans, with the might of their army concentrated on the Soviets, would bleed the Soviet Union white. They thought that D-Day could have happened sooner, rightly or wrongly. Stalin also was upset by, of course, the announcement of the atomic bomb. And whether he knew or he didn't, he was cut out of the A-bomb, and he believed that his allies should have shared with him these nuclear secrets, rightly or wrongly. A couple more things. Of course, Stalin was probably right to detect a shift in American policy when Roosevelt dies and the hardliner Truman takes over. Of course, Truman wouldn't compromise on Poland, the future in Germany, and of course he lends the Lend-Lease loans, the idea that the Americans during the war would lend the Russians equipment, boats, and in exchange for money in some cases, but also in exchange for military bases, the use of their territory, free access to their ports, and things like that. And he ends those the minute the war is over. He doesn't necessarily end those, and of course these things sort of translate themselves into the Marshall Plan for a lot of other countries, but he does so for the USSR. Soviet losses, you can never forget the fact that the Soviets lose about 20 million people, and the land that was occupied by the Germans was primarily in the Soviet Union. And when the war was over, this land was scorched. It was completely destroyed. Therefore, in many ways, people argue, and there's justification in this, the reason he imposed his economic system on Eastern Europe was, simply put, to ensure that he got something back from all of the suffering that was caused, so that the economies of the countries that had invaded him, including Germany, would help pay for the tremendous damage done to the Soviet Union, help their sort of post-war recovery. This also helps explain, perhaps, why he took such an aggressive action in Berlin. Again, you know, his fear, the whole notion of World War II, the extent of his losses and the destruction of his territory, makes us, to a degree, understand why he would be so, perhaps, from hindsight, but you can never say that hindsight is perfect. You've got to put yourself in a person's shoes. The merging of the zones, the creation of Bezonia, for instance, and the creation of a new currency, which certainly is the first step towards establishing a West German state with the central bank, et cetera, are considered by Stalin provocative and very dangerous acts if you consider the history between the Soviet Union and the Germans. Now, moving quickly on to the Americans, the case against the Americans is equally as damning in many ways, and many historians, actually particularly recently, these people known as the revisionists, the people who took the traditional viewpoint and turned it on its head. And of course, the traditional viewpoint, mostly written during the Cold War, was that the Soviets were the baddies. But now the historians, it's become very in vogue to say, well, maybe they're not. Let's take a look at it from the other perspective. And a lot of these people have reached the conclusion that the USA is probably to blame in this matter. These historians give two major reasons the Americans are at fault. The first one was that U.S. policy was influenced by the need or the want to create global free markets for U.S. goods. This is actually, interestingly enough, a parallel between what Woodrow Wilson was trying to achieve at the end of the First World War. He wanted free trade, and he realized that free trade would benefit the Americans to a great deal, being able to flood Europe and a lot of the rich countries in the world with unlimited American products makes American industry grow. On the flip side of that, the Americans, in their position of power at the end of the Second World War, want the same thing. And many ways, you can look at some of their actions, particularly things like the Marshall Aid, as ways to encourage U.S. capitalism. The second one was that the U.S. policy was influenced by important personalities, and particularly the personality of President Harry Truman, hardline ex-communist, anti-communist, not ex-communist, he never was. So let's take a look at this idea of needing to create global free markets. Of course, the notion that they would end the Lend-Lease deals with the USSR in 1945 supports this to a great deal. In other words, that by ending and cutting the USSR to USA, the US could then turn out to the Marshall Aid and give the countries that stayed with it significant sums of money. Now, this is saying to the Soviets really clearly, unless you're on our side, unless you're working with us, we won't trade with you. And the Marshall Aid, in many ways, is not designed to prevent European economies from collapsing. Some argue its true aim is to provide markets for U.S. goods and to ensure that the capitalist free market system is flourishing in Europe as a way for Americans to sell things to Europe. The creation of Bizonia and the introduction of the new currency into the western zones of Germany is a massive breach of the Potsdam Agreements. And the Potsdam Agreement says that Germany will remain split and will remain occupied. It will never be unified. And in fact, by creating Bizonia, this can very well be seen as an American attempt to impose a capitalist system across all of Germany and hopefully incorporate the West. Because, of course, at this particular point, there isn't a solid border. There's no Berlin Wall preventing people from going from the east to the west. So, why not influence people or entice them over to the west to the point that East Germany is not viable as a country anymore? There's also the importance of personalities. Of course, we know that Truman was incredibly aggressive in his dealings with the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, Molotov, at all points around. Actually, after Potsdam, it's really important to note that the Americans and the Russians very rarely talk face to face. There is none, for that matter, communication between Stalin and Truman. A lot of the communication between America and Russia is done between Truman and the foreign minister, Molotov. And Truman is very harsh on Molotov. He basically shows that he will not give in. Not to mention the fact that he was really harsh with Stalin in their meetings in 1945, from April 1945 onward, most notably at Potsdam in the summer of 1945. And of course, Truman could afford to do this. He could test the USSR without the fear of war because he had an atomic monopoly. In other words, he had the bomb and no one else did. And this way, he was allowed to dictate the terms, not only at Potsdam, in many ways in the post-war world. So the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Aid were regarded, perhaps under these circumstances, by the USSR as highly provocative and ways to sort of economically isolate the USSR and keep it within its own sphere of influence, while the US sort of flies around the world and sucks up other countries into its sphere of influence. The US, of course, as in all things, doesn't do this without cause. Number one, you can't underestimate the fact that the U.S. has probably every right to distrust Stalin. He's not a nice man. What happened in Russia during the 1930s and the purges is common knowledge. This is an enemy who you need to keep very close eye on. And when Stalin immediately after Potsdam goes and he disallows the Polish to have free elections, he basically showed that the wartime agreements he made at Potsdam are null and void. Therefore, merging the zones in West Germany, it isn't the first step towards breaking the Potsdam Agreements. It's Stalin's refusal to, ratify or to do what he said he would do at Yalta and then sort of alluded to perhaps doing at Potsdam. Now, Truman also waits a little while. Stalin gets on with things right away. He expands right away. He's undermining communist or legitimately elected governments in Eastern Europe and is installing communist governments right from the get-go. But Truman takes 2 years to really develop a response, and we know that the Truman Doctrine doesn't come until late 1947 and Marshall Plan Aid until late 1948. The Truman Doctrine, as such, perhaps, could be seen as a defensive reaction to the communist threat rather than an aggressive one, because the communist threat had been establishing itself by Stalin doing what he did between 1945 and 1947. Not to mention the fact that the Americans realized the threat to the southeastern Europe, particularly through their involvement in Greece. And the communists were supported by other communist countries, not the least of which the communist governments are firing Russian-made rifles, using Russian-made hand grenades, et cetera, et cetera. And let's not forget that the Americans didn't impose their system on Western Europe. Western Europe had democratic countries. The French voted for their system. The British voted for their system, as did the Austrians and the people of the Netherlands and the people of Belgium, et cetera, et cetera. These countries were free to choose their political and economic systems after the war, and they chose capitalism. And the United States did not interfere in those elections, unlike the Soviets interfered in the elections in the East. So look, there's a lot of reasoning to support the actions of the Americans, and you're really going to have to balance it out. So let's just lay out the key points in this debate. Now, number one, it starts with, and this course starts with, the USA and the USSR ending the Second World War as allies. During the Yalta and Potsdam Conference, they established a framework for the post-war world, and they all agree upon it. Most historians agree that the creation of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe or the division of Germany in 1949 really started the Cold War conflict. But we know that personalities like Truman and personalities like Stalin obviously play a role in the breakdown of relations. We know that Germany proved to be the most sensitive issue dividing the two superpowers, and we also know that Stalin attempted to solve the German problem by forcing the West out of Berlin and blockading it in 1948. We know that that was responded to by the Berlin airlift, and the results of the Berlin airlift actually in many ways stabilized the situation in Germany and its position in Europe. It basically confirmed that Germany would be split into two, and this division of two Germanys, two independent countries influenced by the West in one, and certainly controlled heavily by the East on the other side, will stay that way until 1990 and the fall of the wall. The Western powers, in response to this Berlin action, will set up a military alliance known as NATO to defend themselves against the possibility of Soviet attack in the East, and I suppose by extension, American actions into the 1950s will necessitate the Soviets setting up their own, something known as the Warsaw Pact in 1955. So the question remains, who's at fault? And you're going to have to decide that. All of this evidence is important. You need to start to be thinking, which side am I on, and putting together those column lists, put a little bit in column A, a little bit in column B, and at the end, you need to be able to justify it. And that is the trick to this unit. Good luck. There are no right or wrong answers. Just know your stuff and be able to put what you know behind what you think. Not rocket science, people.